there, my name's Kelsey, and today we're going to be creating a simple tic-tac-toe game using Scratch. This is an advanced level project for those who are new to Scratch, so before beginning, you should already have experience with operators and booleans, variables and lists, broadcasting, etc. So let's get started. As always, we're going to start with our sprites and our backdrops. So I'm going to start with the backdrop, and you'll notice we have just one. It's just plain white. You could change up the color to change the look of your game, but in this case, I've just left it white. And now we're on to the grid. So we're going to come up to costumes, and you'll notice that I have a total of 10 different costumes for this grid. We have an empty grid. We have one with a red line going through the top horizontally, middle, and bottom. And then we have some vertical columns. So we have one marked off on the left, the middle, the right. And then we have three final ones. We have two diagonals going in opposite directions, and we have a draw costume. One other thing you'll notice is all of these costumes are labeled with numbers. We have from 0 to 8, and then we have -1 for our draw. This is because we're going to be using a variable to control which costume is shown, so making them integers like this makes it very easy to edit. So now that that's done, it's time to move on to our symbols. So you'll see we're starting with just a plain white circle. This will be whatever color your backdrop is, and this is essentially to be a placeholder in a cell so that the symbol isn't actually there. Then you'll see I have an X sprite and an O sprite. You'll notice that these, like the grid costumes, are all numbered. So we have 0, we have 1, and -1. I've chosen to make player 2, which is O, -1 instead of a 2 because it will make it easier to switch between the two rapidly. So now it's time to get started on the code. We're going to start by going to Events, dragging out a When Green Flag Clicked, and a broadcast block. You can create a new message called Clear, and what this will do is it will essentially clear the grid of anything that might be on it. So you'll see if I were to start the game and place a couple random X's and O's, if I press the green flag, it will clear them all. So next we're moving on, we're going to define what happens when we receive clear. So we're going to start by creating three variables called moves, game over, and player. What moves does is moves controls the number of symbols that can be placed in the grid at a time. You'll notice that we have 9 separate cells, so moves is going to be set to 9. And then game over controls which costume for grid is shown. So you'll see costume 0 is this blank one. If game over was set to 1, it would later change it to this one, and so on. And now we're going to set player to 1. The player state will always be either 1 or -1, depending on which player it is, 1 being X and -1 being 0. So finally, we're going to delete all of cells. You can create a cells list by going down to your variable section and make a list, and then you can create one here. This is going to be used to control which symbol is in each of the cells for our grid. And finally, what we're going to do for the grid is switch costume to 0, which is just this empty one, and then show the sprite. And now we're going to add code to determine what happens when the space key is pressed. You can go to Events and choose a when space key pressed, and then select an if statement from control. In this case, we're going to use booleans to check if game over is not equal to 0. If so, it will broadcast the clear message. And keep in mind the game over message controls the state of this backdrop. So this is essentially checking to make sure if game over is not equal to 0, so if one player has won or it's a draw, then when the spacebar is clicked, it will clear everything. And finally, we have this when I received play section. You can do this by going to Events and choosing a when I received play block. Then what we're going to do is change our moves variable by -1. This will indicate that one symbol has been placed, so there's one less free cell on the grid. Then we're going to go down and create a custom block. You can do this by clicking on Make a Block, and then you can title it whatever you want. I'm going to make a sample one and call it Winner 2. What you can do for this is you'll see it will bring out a define winner 2, and you'll see your winner 2 block over here. The define block you can stick up at the very top of your code. You'll see I have one all the way up at the top up here. And then your winner block, you can insert right under your change moves by -1. We're going to define what this does later on. And now we're going to grab two if-else statements from the control section. The first one is going to check if game over is equal to 0. If so, it means the game is still being played, and then it will check if player is equal to 1, in which case player 1 has just played. If so, it's going to set player 1 to -1, which will mean it's the other player's turn. Otherwise, it will set the player to the first player. And then finally, in the previous if statements else section, we're going to switch the costume to game over. This means that, say game over were set to 3, it's going to be set to costume 3. If it were 1, it would be set to costume 1, and so on. So now that we've defined all of these blocks, it's time to work on defining our winner function or custom block. So I'm going to minimize this so that it's easier for us to see the entire thing. You'll notice what this is it is essentially an if statement with a bunch of operators inside. So you can grab your if statement from the control section and your operators from this operator section. So to start, what you can do is you'll grab a bunch of if statements and inside, go to variables and grab a set game over to blank. You can actually add all of these in before your operators are done because you're going to start by setting game over to 1, then to 2, to 3, to 4, and so on. So again, this will control which costume is shown. And now it's time to get into the operators. What we're going to do is check if item 1 of cells is equal to player, meaning if there's a player in cell 1, and item 2 of cells is equal to player, which will check if the same player also has a symbol in cell 2, and then we're going to check the same for cell 3, which means the code will only switch to costume 1 or set game over to 1 if all 3 of these cells are filled by the exact same symbol, in which case the costume will be set to 1, like this. We're going to use this same concept to do the next two. We are going to check if 4, 5, and 6 are all the same. If so, we're going to set game over to 2, which means the red line will be horizontal across the center. Then we're going to do the exact same thing for 7, 8, and 9. Coming down lower, we're going to check if cells 1, 4, and 7 are the same. So these will be the cells that run vertically. If so, we are going to set game over to 4. So you'll notice if we go to costumes, this is the one with a red line going vertically. And then we are going to use the exact same concept to check if 2, 5, and 8, which would be the center ones, are the same. And then if 3, 6, and 9 are the same. Now it's time to do our diagonal ones. You'll notice this is going to check if 1, 5, and 9 are the same. If so, it's going to set game over to 7, which you'll see going down here, it's our diagonal. And then finally, you'll see coming back to the code, we're going to check if 3, 5, and 7, which would be going diagonally the opposite direction, are the same. If so, again, the costume will change to match that. Finally, at the bottom, I'm going to zoom in so that it's easier to see. We have two if statements. The first one, we're going to go to operators and select an equal block, and then go down to variables and select our game over bubble. We're going to check if game over is equal to 0. This basically checks if a player has won yet. If not, Then it will check if moves are equal to 0. So are all of these cells filled? Finally, if both of those are true, then we're going to set game over to -1, which you'll see if we come to our costumes is the draw costume. So now that this is done, that is all of the code for the grid sprite, and now it's time to move on to the symbol sprite. This code is quite a bit simpler and there's a lot less of it. So the first thing we're going to do is again define what happens when this sprite receives the clear message. We're going to create two more variables called cell and ID. Notice that cell is different from our cells list that we already created, so you're going to need to keep those separate. You can rename them something different if that's easier for you. So we're going to start by setting ID to 0. What ID will essentially determine is whether the sprite shows the blank circle, the X, or the O. Then we're going to set cell to 1. Again, this will determine which cell it is in. Keep in mind, this is not the cells list, it's just something to keep track of where it is. And now we're going to go to Control and select a repeat 10 times block, but change the number 10 to 9. Then you'll see if we scroll down, we can choose to create a clone of myself. You are going to do this and change cell by 1. What this will do is it will create a clone in each cell of the grid. Finally, we're going to hide the original clone and then delete it. This will make sure that we have only 9. So now that this is done, it's time to move on to our next code segment. We're going to start by setting the ID to the cell. What this will do is it will set our ID variable, which was originally set to 0, to whatever the cell number is. Finally, we're going to insert 0 at the ID of the cells list. So what this will do is it will essentially make sure each sprite is in its correct location to start. Now we're going to make each sprite go to X -85, Y 75, which is going to be this upper section here. Then we have some algebra using our operators blocks. This is going to be different for everybody depending on what their game is like. In this case, I found it worked to do 75 times the ID number, -1, and then mod 3. So what this will do is it will basically place the sprite or the clone of the sprite in one of 3 separate columns. Then we're going to do similar algebra to change Y. So in this case, I found it worked to do -80 times, and then we're going to round anything inside of this. So rounded version of ID -1 divided by 3 minus 0.5. Notice that this algebra is something that you're going to need to change depending on your grid. You can make it much simpler or much harder depending on what you prefer. And then finally, we're going to switch the costume to 0, which is just, as you'll see here, this plain white circle, and show the sprite. And finally, we're on to our last main code segment. We're going to start by going to events and choosing a when this sprite clicked, and then you can grab 2 if statements from the control section. Inside, we're going to grab an operator block, and we're going to choose the equals. We can set the value from 50 to 0 instead. Then for our sensing block, you can find this under sensing, and it's going to be backdrop number of stage. You'll see if we click on it on the backdrop section, we only have backdrop number, name, or volume. So we're going to change stage to grid, and then we can choose game over. And then we're going to set this inside of our operator to check if the game over value of grid is 0. If so, then we're going to run the second if statement. This will check if the item ID of cells is equal to 0. So basically, if there is nothing in the cells. If so, then we're going to replace the item ID of the cells list with the player number of grid. What this will do is basically it will check if it's player one's turn and player one has clicked, then it will place player one's symbol. Otherwise, it will place player two's symbol. And finally, we're going to switch the costume to the item ID of cells, which, as mentioned, will switch the costume to either an X or an O. And then finally, inside the first one and under the second if statement, we're going to broadcast the played message. What this will do is it will just let us know that the player has taken their turn, so it's time for the next player. So that is all the code for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this project, and I hope it goes well for you. If you have any issues with your code, feel free to rewatch this video to figure out how to do it, or check out the article attached.